have this. Okay, so welcome everyone, and oh, my email just left with my introduction here. So again, just so people know, we are recording. We hope to be able to make it available, but again, we're kind of newbies at this whole tech thing. So, and I have the closed captioning going. You might have to also hit live transcript on your own screen if you want to see it. Okay, so thank you everyone to this panel. I just want to begin with a land acknowledgement by acknowledging that we learn and teach and live on or near the ancestral homelands of the Kumtuk and Nonotuck peoples. We acknowledge our institution's role in histories of dispossession and I recognize my own responsibility to forging and respecting Indigenous connections with elders and future generations. So the panel today, we're lucky to have a number of co-sponsors who I want to acknowledge before introducing our panelists. So we're co-sponsored by the UMass Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies Department. This is part of a series on Asian American feminisms that is part of a class. And this is the third panel for the semester. It's also co-sponsored by the UMass Asian and Asian American Studies Certificate, and the 5 College APA Studies Certificate, and the UMass Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture Program with the UMass Fine Arts Center, the Women of Color Leadership Network, and the Center for Women and Community. So our panelists today for this panel on anti-carceral approaches to sexual violence, lessons from Asian American feminist activism. First, we have Professor Grace Kyungwon Hwang, who I could go, I don't even know what to say about Grace, so I'll just give the short version. Director of the Center for the Study of Women and professor in the Department of Asian American Studies and the Department of Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and has been leading or helping to organize a working group on sexual violence at UCLA, which she'll share with us about. Iyko Day is Elizabeth Small Associate Professor of English and Chair of Gender Studies and the program in Critical Social Thought at Mount Holyoke. So I feel like I'm not doing service to anyone's body of work, but hopefully everyone will get a sense of what amazing scholars and scholar activists we have on this panel. But Iyko is the author of Alien Capital, Asian Racialization and the Logic of Settler Colonial Capitalism, and Professor Ren-yo Hwang, who is an assistant professor of gender studies and critical social thought also at Mount Holyoke, and the program co-chair for the 5 College Certificate in Queer, Trans, and Sexuality Studies. Their teaching and research focuses on queer and transgender color critique, feminists of color anti-violence initiatives and genealogies, abolition, transformative justice, and community accountability. So with that, I will turn it over to Grace.
So thank you, Miliann, for inviting me to be a part of this event, and to you and Angie for organizing, and especially for inviting me to speak alongside, Iyko Day and Ren-yo Hwang, who I have known for so long and who are always just so brilliant and wonderful. It's just really just such a joy and a pleasure to be with some of my favorite people in the whole world. So thank you. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so even before the Atlanta murders, the organization Stop AAPI Hate drew national attention by reporting a steep rise in anti-Asian violence exacerbated by racist COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So this discourse rose to a fever pitch in the wake of the brutal murders of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian immigrant women workers at massage businesses in March of this year. And the containment and redirection of the complex affective responses to violence amongst Asian Americans into a narrow discourse of hate and an even narrower understanding of how to address such hate. That is through legislation that turns incidents into hate crimes, which are then remedied through policing and the criminal legal system, has been harrowing, if unsurprising, unfortunately, to watch. So there are many ways to critique hate crimes discourse, for example, for how it activates the carceral state, despite the fact that massage workers, sex workers, and members of Asian American communities have steadfastly maintained that increasing policing and the enactment of hate crimes legislation do not protect them and indeed make them more vulnerable to state and interpersonal violence. And I know that you all had Red Canary Song as a part of this speaker series, and they've of course been one of the most important articulators of this critique before and after Atlanta. And of course, you know, there's the fact that the majority of racial violence incidents that are reported are actually against Black people, who are themselves most likely to be targeted by any activation of the carceral state, rather than find relief or protection through hate crimes legislation or enforcement. So these are all of the different critiques and many, many more of hate crimes legislation. So while there's a lot to say about that today, I want to think about how the punishment framework of hate crimes discourse situates the state as a neutral adjudicator of violence and the source of its remedy rather than the perpetrator. So, and I do so to outline how the university likewise contains the heterogeneous affects that coalesce around sexual violence and channels them via Title IX processes into a desire for punishment-based response. Such management is itself a violation, and is why survivors of sexual violence so infrequently find anything approaching justice through Title IX and other such processes, you know, according to their own self-reporting. In other words, I use these two examples that at first might seem far apart, hate crimes legislation on the one hand and Title IX on the other, to describe the function of the liberal state as managing and containing complex, contradictory, and heterogeneous affects, and channeling them into very narrow modes so as to situate itself as a remedy for rather than the cause of violence. So in both examples, we see the investment in punishment presented as the only and proper way to address violence and harm. Here I just want to point out that, you know, this is an argument that feminist abolitionists have articulated for a very long time. And an abolitionist politics is one that refuses incarceration and its foundational principle of punishment as the solution for social problems. So the aim of prison abolition is to dismantle literal places where people are tortured and warehoused, that is jails, prisons, immigration detention centers, juvenile halls, but to also challenge the belief that punishment solves anything, much less remedies violence and harm. So, and here I want to clarify that there is a difference between punishment and consequences, or punishment and accountability. So the ethos of punishment divides people into perpetrators and victims and establishes an authority, right? Whether the police, the criminal legal system, the Title IX office, as the adjudicator and rightful wielder of retributive violence of a variety of different kinds. Abolitionists maintain that consequences and accountability are only possible outside the structures and logics of punishment. So locked firmly into such structures and logics of punishment, hate crimes discourse turns violence into hate and then hate into crime, which, you know, requires punishment, right? So that is to say, the discourse of hate crimes defines racist violence as caused by individuals acting, irrationally out of hate, and elides the heterogeneity of forms of violence, from militarized and police state violence in the US and abroad, or the slow violence of economic exploitation, dispossession, and extraction. So this channeling of diverse affects that is mobilized by sort of hate crimes discourse is dismayingly effective, as I experienced in the wake of the shootings in Atlanta. So the sort of inchoate, resonant, and oftentimes unnameable but powerful responses to the murders that came from Asian American and other communities seem to me to be both about the spectacularly violent nature of their deaths, but also the less spectacular, more quotidian, but no less brutal nature of their lives. As I read about the weeks on end that these women spent day and night living at these businesses, and often only infrequently seeing the children and families they supported, the sometimes murky circumstances of their migration, the informal under-the-table economies, the saturation of their entire lives by work, it all felt very familiar, both in the sense of well-known, but in the older root sense of family, which in the context of Asian diaspora has historically been inextricable from work. So the powerfully ambient outpouring of affect that I felt from Asian immigrant and Asian American communities in the wake of the Atlanta shootings was so raw and intimate and indefinable. But then it became defined, as we were told over and over again, that the problem was hate, that hate was a crime, and that the solution was reporting and legislation and police and incarceration. So watching the way that hate crimes discourse strangled any other narrative, and in many ways culminated in the passage in May of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, introduced in the House by Representative Grace Meng and in the Senate by Senator Mazie Hirono, I found myself recalling again and again a series of insights articulated by a former student, Miliann, an Asian American Studies major at UCLA, who wrote an honors thesis on the experiences of Asian American student sexual assault survivors, and also created and facilitated this student-initiated course for Asian American sexual assault survivors. And she's turned the syllabus, activities, and lesson plans for this course into this facilitator's guide, which she is happy to share. And a friend of hers is now actually basing a similar course at UC Davis on this facilitator's guide. So this course, a course informed by principles of transformative justice, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, that enabled survivors to collectively support each other as they each came to their own sense of what justice, resolution, and healing would look like. It allowed them to grapple with their experiences within their families' histories of migration and gendered racialization, US war, militarism, and empire, and the resultant impossibility of state-based remedies for sexual violence. And so it occurred to me that many of the reasons why Asian Americans might never find justice in hate crimes legislation are the same as why Miliann and other survivors in this class never found UCLA's Title IX process accessible, appealing, or satisfying, which is, indicated by the very fact that this class had to exist in the first place, right? So there's been a lot written on the limits of punishment-based carceral responses to gender and sexual violence, and I'd recommend scholars and activists like Beth Ritchie, Insight Women of Color Against Violence, Aya Gruber, Emily Sluma, Samina Mullah, Mimi Kim, and many others, who have highlighted how carceral feminist mobilizations for increased policing and incarcerations puts communities, including survivors, already rendered vulnerable by race, class, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender nonconformity, disability, on and on, in peril. Building on their insights, I came to think about how Title IX processes render in the narrowest possible way the wide range of relations of power, violations, modes of agency, and affective implications of sexual violence. Survivors' complex and heterogeneous range of responses, desires, and modes of agency are channeled into a process governed by policies, Title IX policies, which, though not the same as the criminal legal system, replicate many of its assumptions in that they both emphasize a legalistic process of evidence and proof and offer, mainly only punishment of individual perpetrators as remedy, often in ways that exacerbate existing structural inequalities. And I want to just say really quickly here that, in my experience working with Title IX folks, they are really, really like working in good faith, and they more so than maybe any of us really live the limitations of Title IX on a daily basis, right? So again, it's kind of a structural critique of Title IX as a concept, right? This process is one that suppresses the complexity of being of survivors, and at worst, repunishes them for not behaving or feeling correctly, for not being perfect victims. All the various desires that a survivor might have in the wake of violation and violence, desires for acknowledgement, accountability, care, agency, bodily integrity, the latitude to tell your story, to change your story, to have many stories or none, and yes, even desires for vengeance, become arrested, misdirected, and exploited for the purposes of institutional self-legitimation and litigation management. It is no wonder, really, that time and time again, survivors attest that institutional betrayal is as traumatizing as the original violation. So what exactly is a better way? I want to end with an example of an Asian American feminist project that explicitly frames itself against state-based remedies and that begins with the presumption of complexity of personhood. The Anti-Sewing Squad is a group of volunteer mask makers who were located all over the US and Canada, who organized a massive mutual aid campaign, mainly through Facebook, to distribute PPE to marginalized and vulnerable communities. Founded by comedian and performance artist Christina Hwang, the Anti-Sewing Squad made and distributed 350,000 masks for free to first healthcare workers, and then once PPE was more available, to incarcerated and unhoused people, essential workers in low-wage industries, First Nations, migrants, and many other communities. And here, I just want to make a quick pitch about another former student, this time a graduate of the same MA program that Ren graduated from, as well as a PhD program in gender studies at UCLA, and Sewing Squad auntie Preeti Sharma, who co-edited this recently released book about the squad, which is very cool. So, while not exclusively made up of Asian American women, this formation centers Asian American gendered racialization as the historically specific material context which allowed it to emerge. That is to say, the squad's capacity to make masks sprang from the ubiquity of sewing machines and sewing skills amongst Asian and Asian American feminized subjects who have been pushed into low-wage garment production work by the global structuring of the division of labor under neoliberal capitalism, which in turn produced this labor force through the displacement of Asian migrants from their previous modes of life through war, militarism, and capitalist development. Rather than look to the state for remedy, the Anti-Sewing Squad explicitly calls out the, quote, failures of the federal government that led us to a place where aunties have to fix systemic inequalities from our sewing machines, end quote. So most relevant for my point about complex personhood is a brief statement in the FAQ section of the squad's webpage. The response to the question, what makes the Anti-Sewing Squad distinct from other mask-making groups, lists a number of political and interpersonal principles that differentiate them from others, from critiquing the state to smashing the patriarchy, but ends by saying, quote, "Oh, and we also think we are hilarious because we are," end quote. So I would situate being hilarious as an affective practice incommensurate with the refusal of complex subjecthood I've associated with carceral logics. So Christina Hwang's satirical persona as a cruel sweatshop overseer who makes the aunties work at home and who exploits their children references practices that are actually foundational to the garment industry, from work that is paid by the piece and performed in the home, which incentivizes workers to recruit children in order to complete more pieces, to the tendency of subcontractors to be co-ethnics with the sewers and cutters in their factories. A part of the humor, of course, lay in the fact that these hyper-extractive practices, surely familiar, as in family, to many members of the squad, became diverted for the purposes of community and mutual aid. Some of this hilarity is now more widely available in the form of the book, for one, and also Hwang's one-woman show called Sweatshop Overlord, which is currently running, like right this minute, at the New York Theater Workshop. But let us not forget that being hilarious was first and foremost for and by the aunties, uncles, and non-binary people who made up the squad. Being hilarious was something they did together for each other while locked in at home in the midst of a pandemic and trying to stem an overwhelming tide of illness and death for the most vulnerable using only their home sewing machines. Inhabiting hilarity with themselves as the primary audience and as a part of a practice of radical care and relationality, the Auntie Sewing Squad listened to and for each other in the context of quotidian violence. And I know you're thinking now, what does this have to do with sexual violence and Title IX? And the connection is something called transformative justice. So I'm not claiming to be an expert in transformative justice in any way. What I know about it, I learned from people like Miriam Kaba, Mia Mingus, Elisa Bieria, and others who have practiced and theorized transformative justice for decades. So Mingus describes the foundational goal of transformative justice in the following way, quote, "How can we respond to violence in ways that not only address the current incident of violence, but also help to transform the conditions that allowed it to happen," end quote. She goes on to say, quote, "This is why it is critical that transformative justice is not simply the absence of the state and violence, but the presence of the values, practices, relationships, and world that we want." The Auntie Sewing Squad put into practice the values, relationships, and world that they wanted, one which envisioned people who could care for others by making masks, but might also themselves need care through connection and hilarity. Strong communities are our best response to violence and harm, from within and without. With this in mind, I think back to my former student Miliann and her classmates, who likewise strove to recognize the complex interiority, context, and history of survivors, building an understanding that, as legal scholar Patricia Williams writes, quote, "Truly total relationships call up images of whole people dependent on whole people," end quote. A fragile floral offering upon which to build a world. Thank you.
Should I just go next? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. That was such a rich talk, Grace. And I also want to thank Angie, Miliann, Cian, and Porntip for inviting me to this important conversation with two of my favorite people and colleagues, Professors Grace Hwang and Ren-yo Hwang. So I want to begin by acknowledging that my institution, Mount Holyoke College, sits in the Connecticut River Valley on the ancestral territory of the Nonotuck people, which neighbors the traditional lands of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. This land acknowledgement does not take the place of land back which is a movement that seeks to reestablish Indigenous political and economic control over stolen land. Settler colonialism has contributed to the historic and ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and I urge everyone who has the privilege of learning, teaching, and working on this land to support and participate in Indigenous community-based organizations and social justice movements. Okay, so hashtag Stop Asian Hate, which I'm glad Grace showed a poster of that. So that hashtag Stop Asian Hate has become a rallying cry in response to the surge in anti-Asian violence since the beginning of the pandemic, from random brutal attacks on the elderly to a white gunman's murder of 6 Asian women, as well as 2 others in Atlanta in March. What I would like to contribute to this discussion of gendered anti-Asian racism is its particular intersection with anti-Blackness, especially in light of viral images of Black people attacking Asians that have also circulated in social media and on the news. And I'd also like to make some additional connections regarding the global dimensions of US imperialism and that's relevance. So in terms of the first point, as incidents of anti-Asian violence have accumulated alongside a continuous stream of viral videos of police officers killing Black people, there has been a tendency to collapse all forms of anti-Asian and anti-Black racism, racial violence into kind of an amorphous framework of white supremacy. At the same time, videos of Black men attacking Asians have kind of undercut the universality of the white supremacy narrative, instead reinforcing stereotypes of Black criminal aggression while promoting the exceptional vulnerability of Asian Americans to racist violence. So these kinds of generalizations about white supremacy or the aberrational quality of anti-Asian violence risk obfuscating the structures of racial disposability embedded in racial capitalism. So by contextualizing anti-Asian racism within a longer arc of capitalist development, I think that understanding the racial discontinuities are just as important as understanding the continuities for determining our collective response. So I think it's especially important to recognize that Asian American racialization exists on a settler colonial terrain of anti-Blackness. So rather than create an equivalence between anti-Asian and anti-Black racisms, I want to underscore the asymmetries of racial difference that coalesce to produce and reproduce the inequality and scarcity that capitalism requires. And so I'm happy to elaborate more on this first point that I wanted to make in the Q&A or later at another time, but that was the first point that I wanted to make. So the second point I wanted to contribute to this conversation has to do with the global dimensions of US imperialism that were shaped by the continental accumulation of Indigenous land and African bodies. The history of US imperialism is intertwined with the association of Asian women with sex work that informed the horrifying murders of the Asian spa workers. During the expansion of US empire from the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century, the post-war occupation of Japan, and the wars in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, sex work was the mode of survival for Asian women in devastated countries. In the post-World War II era, the building of military operations and bases in Asia and the Pacific went hand in hand with the expansion of the sex industry in military camp towns and the development of Thailand's modern day sex tourism industry. Camp towns, particularly in South Korea, reinforced a culture in which American GIs were effectively immune from prosecution for the rape and murder of any Asian woman, regardless of their employment. This culture of sexual violence has steadily been transplanted to southern US bases where camptown massage parlors and spas were reconstituted through brokered marriages between GIs and camptown madams after troop reductions in South Korea impacted the military sex economy. Referring to the futility of containing the so-called human spillover of empire, Yuri Dulin it underscores how US military encounters in Asia have changed American society by bringing US imperial spaces, practices, and subjects into the home front. The acute vulnerability of Asian women who were killed in March is layered onto the devaluation of Black and Indigenous women. Historically, the legal protection of white women's virtue was not extended to Black and Indigenous women. As critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw has demonstrated, rape statutes were limited to the regulation, protection, and restoration of white female chastity. Alternatively, for Black women, chastity was never presumed and therefore outside the law's protection. Courts in some cases, in some states, went so far as to instruct juries that unlike white women, Black women were not chaste, which made it virtually inconceivable that a Black woman could even be raped or that a man could be convicted of doing it. The intersection of colonialism and misogyny also informs the movement for murdered and missing Indigenous women, which has exposed the vulnerability of Indigenous women to murder by non-Native men. Even after the passage of the 2013 Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, even after that passage of that reauthorization, violent crimes on Native lands remain subject to federal and state law rather than Native judicial systems, creating an accountability vacuum in which non-Native men can commit rape and murder on Native land with virtual impunity. In the case of Asian women, their sexual deviance was constructed in immigration policy and reinforced by US militarism in Asia. This confluence of domestic and global context subjects them to the threat of sexual violence, while their presumed sexual immorality serves to justify increased surveillance, policing, and criminalization. So despite the historical asymmetries and continuities that exist between and across the experiences of racialized groups, the state has offered only a single solution to address anti-Black and anti-Asian violence: the expansion of anti-discriminatory policing and hate crime legislation, most recently with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that Grace also discussed. The George Floyd bill bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants and limits qualified immunity, among other reforms. Designed to eliminate discriminatory policing, the bill gives millions of dollars to the police during an unprecedented economic and health crisis that has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. If passed, which seems unlikely, the George Floyd Act authorizes new grant programs that will allocate a combined $850 million to investigate repeated civil rights violations and deadly use of force by law enforcement. As Miriam Kaba notes, this funding offers an expensive answer to a non-existent question. They already know how we die, it's policing, she says. The tragic irony of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is that none of its provisions would have saved the life of the man for whom it was named. Floyd's death was not the result of a chokehold, a no-knock warrant, qualified immunity, or racial profiling. Rather, he was killed by a police officer who knelt on his neck for 9 minutes. Regardless of reforms, the police have at their disposal any number of ways to kill a person. The state of New York spent $35 million to train officers to comply with the ban on chokeholds, but this did nothing to save Eric Garner's life. As Kaba emphasizes, the only way to prevent people from dying at the hands of the police is to reduce police contact with with communities of color. Like the George Floyd Act, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act will allocate funding to expand reporting and data collection by the Department of Justice, adding to existing hate crimes legislation that includes sentencing enhancements. Just as the police reform bill would not have protected George Floyd, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act does not increase the safety of Asian women who work in stigmatized industries. The bill largely disregards the public statements of Asian American community leaders and organizations, including Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta and the grassroots migrant sex worker coalitions Red Canary Song and Butterfly, which have opposed additional policing. They have advocated instead for the legalization of sex work as the most effective means of increasing safety for migrant women employed in these industries, whether they are engaged in sex work or not. What calls for more policing and more surveillance fail to acknowledge is that massage parlors are already surveilled, criminalized, and targeted by immigration raids. It is precisely in these contexts in which police departments double as border enforcement that migrant workers become powerless and hyper-exploitable. So I want to just conclude by emphasizing that, anti-Asian racism isn't exceptional, nor was it initiated by the xenophobic ravings of the former US president. It is instead deeply embedded in the colonial anti-Black foundations of our racial capitalist order. Since the 19th century, economic and social locations, particularly for white men, have presented ideal conditions for the growth of the violent patriarchal defense of the natural white world. In the current moment, the gendered economic and political dislocations resulting from a 40-year period of wage stagnation, the deterioration of white male breadwinning potential, and the steady decline of US hegemony, global hegemony, present the prime breeding ground for reactionary racist populism. So in order to end these forms of gendered racist violence, it would require an end to US empire, an end to militarism and policing, criminal punishment, state regulation of women's bodies, and an end to an economy based on violent relations of individualism over interdependence, of scarcity over abundance. Alternatively, anti-discrimination and anti-sex trafficking and hate crimes legislation represent what my colleague, who is up next, Professor Ren-yo Hwang, calls carceral care, which are punitive solutions that expand the power of prisons, borders, and bases that disproportionately target the very gendered racialized bodies they purport to protect. COVID-19 still has much to teach us, perhaps most urgently that it is time to stop looking to the carceral state for the care and protection it cannot give. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's hard to follow Grace Hwang and Iyko Day, but I'll try to offer a bit of what I can. I just want to first thank all of you all for being here today, and for Miliann and Angie for the vision of building this program. And thank you, CN and Parntip, for supporting, and everyone else in the WGS department. I thank you for Iyko's land acknowledgement, which I think is really helpful beyond just a land acknowledgement. Additionally, I like to read Nohem Kashet Schilling, who is a local native Two-Spirit elder, has kind of taught me so much about understanding South Hadley, the area that I reside, and in terms of being Noatak Alliance, Quabog, and Agawam and Nipmuc Place, including the Chisuk and Willamnenset and Wolther Awansik agents people. So it's kind of complicating what we know now as the first kind of places settled in the US, and how complicated even our understandings of indigenous territories are here. And so kind of my investment in supporting that collective I think, investment and investigation into where we are. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about that the call to hate crimes, often we think about it as kind of this state perpetrated and kind of practice that's being enforced upon us from law enforcement agencies and state agencies. And I'm going to turn a little bit to how actually Asian American civil rights organizations have very much been a part of this legacy and this call, and how we've kind of been trapped into these worse and worse off options, right, when we think about what we mean by anti-violence. So I won't get in too far into, this is a lot of the book I'm working on, but I'll just give pieces, hopefully, that are helpful to embellish a bit of what Grace and Iyko have offered. So Some of it will sound repetitive. As calls from within Asian American AAPI organizations and legislators to demand more efficacious prosecution, tallying, and policing resources to assist in the logging, reporting, and follow-up on anti-Asian hate crimes, or the rhetorical pivot we've heard here, stop AAPI hate or stop Asian hate. Our work now is to take stock of the troubling and misplaced faith in the criminal punishment system as the vehicle in which justice and restoration by our predecessors and collaborators that exists between academic, policy, and legal civil rights organizations over the last 4 decades. Stop AAPI Hate, like other minority organizations, have become more weary over time of collaborations as liaisons with local law enforcement, centered as instead in values of education and policy, a community database, keen on creating their own reporting mechanisms for archiving violence. Cases of quote unquote hate violence or hate incidents rely on the premise of the association of hate to violence, as Grace has offered, as to hate to crime, still prosecutorial, judicial, and penalty first in nature. How does the discourse of hate provide any survivor-centered relief following experiences of violence or even death? Rather, it is the focus on the possessive investment in exceptionalizing identitarian innocence through data as a faulty means to evidence systemic violence as reducible to individual actors. Even when such alternative reporting mechanisms like Stop AAPI Hate, which they are not themselves, such as the UCR crimes report, right, which is part of like a state mechanism of violent crime data collection. So Stop AAPI Hate avoids explicit intent to punish and criminalize, as they say on their website. What does it mean when even the collection of such data is used to uphold a faulty mythos of a racialized, proto-criminal, hateful other? Jin Hortorn describes this as the hate/crime paradigm. He writes, the sticking, in referring to Sarah Ahmed's terms, of criminality and pathology to bodies and populations that are already seen as hateful, where hate therein functions as a racialized discourse. Even in the shift away from crime and the rhetorical driving device of hate in trending hashtags like Stop Asian Hate, the intention is to bring attention or intervene on anti-Asian violence. Therein lies an embedded anti-Black pathologization, not only in the utterance of crime, of hate crime, but in the discourse of hate itself. The hateful other, as Hortorn describes, also, quote, also becomes the grounds against which all racialized peoples must perform conformity to our oppression, end quote. The stickiness is in the production of such binary logics of pathways to self-preservation, both in the disciplinarity and punishment of carceral and side discourses and logics, but too in the ideological state apparatus and governmentality that, to quote, and with Hortorn, incites us to become docile subjects who labor hard to not appear hateful when confronted with dehumanization. Even in the case with stopaaphate.com, there's a purposeful de-emphasis on perpetrators you can find in the FAQ, which I think is an important pivot. And I'll quote because I think it's helpful. It asks, do you have data on perpetrators of hate incidents? And they reply, we do not collect information on perpetrators because we're centering what's happening to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We already know that every group holds implicit biases against other groups. We're not interested in racially profiling other groups, inflaming tensions. Racial data on perpetrators doesn't help in developing policy to protect Asian American Pacific Islanders. But you'll find, and that's the end of that, though the intent here is to focus on education, amelioration of harms, measures in the direction of restorative justice, nonetheless, and transformative justice, as Grace Hwang's talk ended on, its policy focus still requires an extended, albeit more tractable, relationship with government and law enforcing institutions. Following the signing into effect of the federal COVID, which has been mentioned several times, COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act in May of 2021, Stop AAPI Hate said, praise the legislation for investing in community-centered solutions and provisions to mitigate anti-Asian rhetoric, end quote. But the legislation is needed And they add on, further legislation is needed to address, quote, root causes of systemic racism and oppression. So we're on track to like critiquing the ways in which there are these faulty partnerships with state, but what's actually happening, right, in the wake of this law. So this is to say, even in an explicit call to move away from perpetrators, what's being implied here as the racialized other that we're not interested in profiling. The implicit nod is to known Asian and Black historical conflict that's neither fully acknowledged or unpacked in such generalizing rationales for the database itself. Not unlike the post-racial pivot by NYPD Asian Hate Crimes Task Force Twitter page, explicit footage and photos from CCTV and surveillance cameras post alerts of unidentified male, unidentified female, description of location and victim, and a call to report information back to NYPD. So there's been like this pivot to actually remove race, right? To not seem as being partially biased to saying that a perpetrator is of a certain race. So it's an interesting. So the call for Asian American communities to pay attention to such alerts, to respond to such calls, to participate in surveillance, watch, evaluate, review the footage, analyze, infer, and then community, police, Black and brown others, both stoke spheres of the racialized perpetrator, all while training community to understand and insist on carceral mechanisms as the best and only play toward safety. Meanwhile, and I thought I would actually write more about this for this talk, but I just didn't get to it. But meanwhile, the reporting of interpersonal, domestic, familial, gender, sexual, and interethnic violence is often implied as normalized and unutterable violence within Asian diasporic communities, right? And I say that from a position of actually having experienced that through seeing many, many people within my family and surrounding families go through these experiences, right? So how is it that there's such a deep disconnect when we're thinking about anti-violence in the context of Stop Asian Hate? So I'll start to wrap up. But the demand to illustrate and narrativize targeted violence upon particular identifiable, however contested the said identity is, the community, it means to engage in a discourse of victim exceptionalism, one which even as hate crimes data has reported, even by its own logic, and this was mentioned earlier, the irrefutability of anti-Black violence as always quantifiably the highest overrepresented on annual reporting charts since the publishing of data under the moniker of hate crimes since the 1990s, the federal 1990s Hate Crimes Statistics Act. So it's the very normalization and expectation of anti-Black violence as unexceptional that makes for the racial cross comparison in which quote unquote spikes or epidemic violences follow events of structural violence, such as historicizing events that only go to frame as a context but not connection, a swell of targeted violence. So whether it's anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh, or anti-Islamic violence following 9/11, anti-Latinx, anti-immigrant violence following institutionalization of ICE and ICE raids since the Obama era and previous, and most emblematized in the Trump administration with the anti-Asian xenophobic sentiments since COVID-19. So the mainstream concerns and calls for added police response and resources, all while law enforcement are rescued from being charged of hate crimes on duty, the malleability and perverse nature of hate crime laws in its strategic dissociation with conditions and structures of violence is most vividly on display with the Blue Lives Matter anti-police hate crimes legislation from 2016 that the Louisiana Governor John Bell Edwards signed into to protect law enforcement as a social targeted group under the category of hate crimes. So I'm gonna skip ahead, and I wanted to just kind of conclude in thinking about, well, maybe I won't read this, but I was just writing a little bit, and it's taken me some time to go back to watch the footage of Captain Jay Baker, who did that kind of 1.5-minute viral video in response to Robert Aaron Long, who was the shooter. And so maybe think I'll pause there for time, but basically I was doing kind of a closer reading of thinking about kind of the use of sex addiction, right? And the ways in which we see kind of sexual temptation or the use of temptation as this logic, right, to build empathy towards Robert Hwang. But I'm kind of describing the ways in which, how does this kind of relate to our understanding of what we're seeing, I think, in the framing of recently with Kyle Rittenhouse and Judge Bruce Schroeder's kind of response and empathy towards him, right? But the ways in which we have a sense of, maybe I'll just read, the kind of who has suffered the most, right, in these kind of incidences, and how normatively it is from Brock Turner, right, when we're thinking about what's happening in college campuses and turning to some of the questions that were provided by Professor Kang's class, that the ways in which we continuously see, and it gets kind of pointed to as like bias from judges, right, or bias from prosecution or police or law enforcement, right, as somehow aberrant to the ways in which law, as Professor Day has laid out, has this longer legacy in which it already kind of is functioning to think about the protection of white innocence. And so I'm just been really kind of rattled in thinking about this idea of the temptation to be eliminated and how that relates to this longer legacy of criminalization of sex work, both here and abroad. And so, but I'll pause there because that's a lot to unpack and connect. And I didn't do, I think, that conversation justice, but I do think it's related when we're thinking about where we're actually pressing for kind of support to interrupt and prevent violence in our communities, right? And how far we are from, in terms of even the dissociation of wanting to understand the massage workers as sex workers potentially, right? And I think Red Canary Song, which visited the class, probably did such a great job of explaining and unpacking those connections. But I really do think we're so far from really kind of building that kind, the kind of need for transformative justice as like a now and present practice that's already happening in terms of how people are surviving the criminalization of sex work in their bodies. But so I'll pause there, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open it up for questions. Angie, I don't know if you want to segue with any comments. We have a few students who want to ask questions directly, but I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that these issues that we're talking about are impacting our campus right now, individually and collectively. And there have been events and protests and organizing on our own campus that, again, sort of we're hoping you can help us think through, in real time, and on the ground. You offer this incredibly rich historical intersectional critique. And then the conversation that's often happening, as Grace was saying, with Title IX, offices or administrators, oftentimes, again, in good faith, but are around things like, consent workshops at first year orientations and, bystander intervention trainings and who is a mandatory reporter. So how do we bridge, again, sort of these conversations to bring in this larger critique to address sort of, again, sort of the, again, everyday kind of policing and policymaking that is unfolding, on not just our campuses, but campuses around the country, and then particularly learning from some of the initiatives that you all have been a part of.
Yeah, Miliann pretty much covered the context here on the ground. You know, Miliann and I have been going to meetings as representatives of WGSS all over campus, and we keep saying there's research on this, you know, like we're not making it up. So thanks, Miliann. Can we give Miliann a round of applause for all the work that she's done to pull this series together and bring you all here. Yeah, this is the conversation we need to be having. So I'm so glad you all are here, and thank you. Let's hear from
So you've seen
students
some of
then.
the questions. We have these amazing students who hopefully will engage directly with you.
Yeah, Miliann. Oh, go ahead.
Hi. Obviously I'm a student at UMass, and like within the context of UMass, there's like proliferation of sexual assault and harassment on campus, in relation with like the large Greek life on campus, but beyond that, just like the culture within like all campuses and universities. And then on top of that, like every other university you have to go through UMPD, which is like their university policing, which already on our campus has a history and pattern of being racist and are racist, right? So I'm curious about in your like research or like observing on your campus, like respective campuses, if you have observed like how have students organized and like have like organized in order to create like alternative ways to, I guess, create like brave spaces for victims and survivors in order to like still seek their own self like sense of justice without having to navigate the spaces of like police and like bureaucracy of the university.
Oh, absolutely. That is just, I mean, that is the key question. That's it. That is the question. So thank you for that. That's so important. You know, just briefly, you know, at UCLA, there has been lots and lots of different kinds of organizing. And I just want to acknowledge that, you know, at the Center for the Study of Women, we have a research stream called Sexual Violence and Intersectionality. That's one of the sort of parts of that is a sexual violence working group, as well as other projects. And I just want to observe that this even came to CSWs to be a CSW priority several years ago, now over 5 years ago, because there was student organizing on campus. This graduate student group, mostly graduate student group called Bruins Against Sexual Harassment, or BASH, who came together after this really terrible institutional response to sexual harassment by a history professor, Gabriel Peterberg. You know, so speaking of institutional violence, basically every terrible thing that institutional actors could do, they did, you know, to the grad students who were sort of, you know, speaking up about this person's harassment of them. So, you know, you know, there's a variety of different kinds of organizing that has happened. So specifically, you know, I want to highlight, you know, some of the work that folks have been doing and the directions it's gone. Some of it has been about sort of changing and reforming Title IX policy and Title IX practices. So there has been some of that. You know, some of it has also been sort of more organized around transformative justice practices and instituting that on campus. For the Center for the Study of Women and the work that I am doing is we are slowly, very slowly, you know, bringing together a set of people across campus to sort of think about how to provide alternatives to the Title IX process. So, you know, our priority has been not to try to fix Title IX, there are other people doing that, and but our priority has been to try to provide different kinds of alternatives. And the issue with UCLA, which is particular to its institutional structure, is that it's huge and incredibly decentralized. So there are pockets of people who are doing different kinds of work in the care program office, and the care program is the one confidential sort of university site for sexual assault and sexual violence survivors. So there are people doing this kind of work in the care office, there are people doing this kind of work in the law school and public health, in different parts of the campus, in gender studies at CSW. And it's just been work to get people together and to even know about the work that they've been doing. So that's actually been a lot of the work of the last few years. Now we're, kind of trying to establish different models, and in particular working, thinking about what it means to work with UCLA undergraduate and graduate, but focusing on undergraduate student organizations. And what that means is figuring out what it means to build student or to support student organizations to build their own communities and structures from the ground up, right? In ways that would, so that they have resilience around harm, right? So even before any incident of sexual violence or harm or whatever happens, right? Like that's too late, right? I mean, that's not to say there's nothing you can do. You're just saying, like, we kept having to pull it back and back and back and back, right? We started off by saying, like, okay, like what happens if someone who is in Samahang Filipino or, the, Muslim Student Association or whoever causes harm to, like, there's a sexual violence incident or sexual harassment or other kinds of violence and harm, right? And then, based on a variety of work on transformative justice and restorative justice, we were like, oh no, you have to start even before that, right? So those are some of the things we're trying to work on. I also want to point out as a really amazing model, lost it. The community, what is it called? Community Dialogue Project at Brown, which was, they brought in Mariam Kaba as a consultant at Brown. And this is a transformative justice project that is embedded in the community, as well as, sort of interrupting that sort of town gown division. It's grounded, it's funded by Brown, but the decision-making structures are embedded in community, which I think is ideal, right? And they've got this amazing website, something like that for UCLA would be kind of a dream, it'd be kind of be the ideal.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us, and your talk has been so enlightening, so thank you. And so my question is kind of exploring the idea of punishment and thinking about if punishment is a creation of settler colonialism and how that will inherently perpetuate violence. How can we separate ideas of healing and justice from this framework in the larger sense outside the institution?
That's so great. That's so great. Okay. That is also the question. There's just, like, every question is the question. I don't know, Iyko or Ren? Ren, did you want to kind of try to respond? I know this is something you think about a lot.
You were asking, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Mandana.
Mandana. So how punishment, I thought Grace was going to take that one.
No, no worries. I totally can.
But
You know, yeah, but if you had something to say, it's up to you.
I mean, so much of the ways in which we think about the supposed secular, you know, criminal punishment system, but when I was thinking about even, you know, how we've come to frame certain things as just intrinsically should be criminalized, right? So much of it has to do with a mode of engagement that's based on a kind of heteropatriarchal masculinization of ownership, right? And so that kind of ownership, which for so long had been normalized as proper modes of relationships, right? Which we now know to be wholly unconsensual, right? And so I think when we think about just, you know, even this area, right, how the many stories we will not fully know of what was considered what they thought to be kind of an agreement of terms to settle in this area were, you know, non-consensual is like the lightest way to put it, the euphemistic way to put the kind of violence that subtends what we understand as now colonial law. And so, but I'll let Iyko and Grace jump in, but yeah, so absolutely, I think that's just been, I think it's a part of what we understand as rape culture too, right? The idea that like there's invitations that are signaled, right? Because of way someone is dressed, right? The mode of what they drank that night, right? I was reading over, I think her name was Chanel Miller's response to Brock Turner, right? Like the kinds of repetitive questions that are really trying to engage her as somehow at fault, right? And you see that kind of repeated in kind of the ways in which Robert Long was taking care of, like, was it the sex addiction? We're so sorry, right? That drove you. And so I'm getting away from your question, but just to say that we kind of see this repetition of the ways in which heteropatriarchal settler colonial masculinization that has been normalized in just even our cultures of modes of exchange. Beyond just the law, it's how then we engage with the law too, right? And I think we see those same pitfalls as the students, I think, are rallying against in Title IX, right? So it's a certain kind of evidencing of yourself, right? To prove your kind of innocence from what had happened, right? In the cases in which it has to do with, say, like two students where the assumption is like the lines of victim perpetrator binary is not clear, right? So let's pause.
Well,
I can,
so,
I think time is going so fast. We have two more questions. Can I get the two students to ask the questions and then just open it up for responses? Okay.
Hi, I guess my question, it was in the chat earlier, so you can refer to that, but it was just kind of wondering, like, how do we work towards like anti-carceral logics in our lives, like personally and in community? Because I think that's kind of at the heart of like what we're talking about, and like, how do we get rid of like the policing that goes on in our head?
Hi. So when the conversation was kind of about like the annexation of Hawaii and the colonization of Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, Vietnam, all those countries, I was kind of drawing a connection to the Brock Turner case. And actually, Ren, you did speak on it just now briefly. Can we say that the framework for that narrative of Asian female bodies being policed by white masculinity, can we say that that framework is still instilled in our educational institutions, even of higher education, and the policing of female Asian bodies is still going on? Because with the Brock Turner case, we all saw how that went, and I would love to hear what you guys had to say about it. Thank you.
Iyko, were you going to jump in earlier?
I was, but I feel like this last question, maybe Ren-yo would like to take it, or.
totally jump in, and I'll jump in if it makes sense, if you have time.
I guess I don't know if this addresses a little pieces of a bunch of questions, but except for the last one, which probably Ren should take. But I think that also just thinking about affects, I think that, you know, we have to recognize that the desire for punishment and vengeance is a really human reaction, you know, in a society that's incredibly patriarchal and punitive, right? So, but we have to, you know, and again, all of these are ideas that I've sort of distilled from Mariame Kaba's work and other people, you know. And so the thing is that we have to recognize is that the desire to punish is not going to be addressed in an accountability process. The process of healing or resolution may also not be possible in an accountability process. So we have to really think about distinguishing what the emotional outcome we're expecting from different processes of punishment and accountability. And one of the quotations that comes to mind from Mariame Kaba is that, you know, abolitionism is not a politics mediated by emotional responses. Abolition is not about your fucking feelings. So mistaking emotional satisfaction for justice is not abolitionist. Even though I'm watching with, you know, rapt attention the Rittenhouse trial, as I'm sure everyone else is, or, you know, watching Derek Chauvin or R. Kelly be convicted, you know, so that, you know, we have, I certainly could recognize my own desire to punish, right? But that's not the same as kind of calling for abolition or thinking through accountability, and also recognizing that we can't really prosecute our way out of harm, right? So that was just one of the thoughts that I had, and just on the same subject of punishment, which I think Ren-yo also kind of addressed, which is that, you know, historically, the culture of blaming the victim is embedded in our history, right? So, you know, under, you know, in 1855, you know, Black women who were killed their masters in self-defense were prosecuted and punished, right? Being guilty of, because she was a, you know, a Black slave was a piece of property, not a person. Which kind of reinforces the point that Ren-yo was making earlier. And you can sort of fast forward, and I'm thinking of to 2004 to the 16-year-old Cyntoia Brown who shot Johnny Allen, who, you know, and she killed him in self-defense. Again, she was punished for acting in self-defense, essentially. And then she was also added with this sort of, she was also being framed as a sex trafficker because she was not an innocent victim, as a sex worker. And so we see how punishment has long sort of been, you know, how blaming the victim is kind of part of the structure of this heteropatriarchal punishment system. So I think that was kind of one of the thoughts that came to mind, but I'll just stop there.
Well, so just as a quick response, if that's all right, Miliann, just connecting some of the other questions as well in the Q&A about, you know, how do you talk to family members and people in the community, and, you know, and I think these are all very connected and relevant. And so what I want to start off with by saying is that as a Korean immigrant woman, my desire for vengeance is very, very strong. And, you know, and I just want to acknowledge that it's, which is also something that Mariame also says, is that, like, you know, we are like in this society, like there is a certain level of pleasure, right? That this idea of punishment gives us. And I feel that so strongly, right? And, you know, I think when, you know, Mariame is saying that, you know, abolition is not about your fucking feelings, you know, she's not saying that feelings don't matter, right? And I think that's what's been, you know, that's what I was trying to emphasize in relationship to this idea of complex personhood, right? You know, what complex personhood means is recognizing that everyone does harm, right? That you know, which is, you know, and that, you know, that taking a place of, you know, the righteously indignant adjudicator, right? Which again, Korean immigrant women love that space, right? But like not helpful, you know, or you know, feel your feelings, but then, you know, don't base your societal structures on them. You know what I mean? So, you know, a part of this is about recognizing everyone as having the capacity to do harm and doing harm, right? All the time. It is not possible to go through the world without hurting people, right? Sadly, right? Or you know, that's just what a complex personhood, you know, Patricia Williams saying relationships are based on whole people, dependent on whole people. That's what that means, right? That's you know, how I think I try to approach like, you know, people in my family and communities, and you know, yeah.
So I'm so sorry to cut this conversation short. I do want to make an announcement that, again, sort of we hope to have ongoing conversations, but very particularly, Angie, do you want to say something about the course that you're going to be offering?
Sure. One of the things that has become clear in our conversations is there's some incommensurability across frameworks, right? So like dealing with the emotional piece, like initially part of the conversation was students were outside protesting, flipping cars over, you know, and the administration is responding, no, you know, no crime has been reported. What is going on? So we were trying to have so many different sorts of conversations at the same time across each other, and people are coming from different offices, you know, and different groups. And so we brainstormed together, Miliann and I, and folks from the CWC who are here, but we can't see them, the Center for Women and Community, that it would be nice to have, to carve out some time and space to actually workshop the problem of sexual violence. So we're going to offer a 200 level class in WGSS in the fall. That is a workshop on the problem of sexual violence. And we will be thinking with art and poetry, and we will have some scholars come in and talk about Title IX, and we'll think about the history of activism. And we're a big group of people are workshopping the course description. I'm the instructor of record, but one day a week we'll have a guest speaker come in, so expect to hear from me. Yeah, so we're trying to think of ways to just carve out more time and space to actually have these conversations and think about building the community that we need to have the safety that we need. And
again, I'm sorry to cut it short, but there's another class coming in here and I have to let my class go. And we, you know, look for ongoing announcements and additional events, and again, sort of think about registering for this course. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Ren. Thank you, Iyko. All right.
Thank you. It was so great to see you, Grace.
So good to see you.
So good to see you.
Bye.
So we'll be in touch about permissions to share and all that kind of stuff.
Okay,
Great.
great.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone.